Right. So again, thank you everyone who joined us today. This is a very special webinar marking a very special occasion. Today we're launching our 10th annual NYU Riskathon simulation. And in light of this, we wanted to invite the lead analyst for the simulation, Dr. Maha Hosain Aziz, to reflect about the past decade, about our predictions, and what this teaches us about the decade ahead. And Dr. Hussein Aziz is a professor at NYU teaching global risk and prediction, and she's an award-winning author. And as I mentioned, she's the lead analyst for this very special simulation. And yeah, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tali. Hi, everybody. It's great to see you. I see some familiar names on the list, so great to have you. Yes, this is quite a accomplishment for us, right? Collectively to have done this for 10 years. I thought given this occasion, it would be worthwhile to reflect on what we said 10 years ago. What were we thinking about when we kicked off this project? And I was digging around to see what did we say back in December 2016, and I came across this article that we had put together in the Observer that broke it down according to growing risks, growing risks that we felt were threatening global stability at the time. And so I just wanted to revisit that and then reflect to what extent we might have been correct, given everything we've observed since then. So number one, we had talked about or we had raised the question as to America's role in the world back in December 2016. We talked about this global crisis of international legitimacy. Is America's unipolar moment over? At that stage, we did acknowledge that many policymakers around the world, academics, analysts, journalists were debating this perceived decline of the US. And of course, we noted, like many, that other superpowers were rising at that stage, Russia, India, China in particular. This was also when President Trump was in office the first time around. And we did at that stage speculate that maybe we are now officially moving into a multipolar era after 25 years of hegemony. And I believe Eurasia Group at the time had talked about our geopolitical recession. So I think from that perspective, I think we were spot on that this that this decline in US power, excuse me, had begun. And I think on some level we were exactly right. Obviously, nobody could have predicted that the US would see the return of President Trump. But the reality is, in every sim that we've done since December 2016, we've recounted the decline of the US. And I think that's something to keep in mind. I would question, as we did last year, to what extent it's multipolar, or are we perhaps easing into a polycentric world order? Is it sufficient to understand the world through the lens of simply the state or through the lens of a couple of superpowers? I think given the burden that many superpowers feel domestically and with major wars and climate change and AI, I think the big powers are burdened, and this is an opportunity. This is the opportunity amidst the heightened geopolitical risk, which has also come up in our more recent simulations, that smaller countries and smaller actors or non-state actors, including the tech firm, can play a bigger role in how the world order evolves. So in terms of our first major judgment back in 2016, I think we were spot on. And I think that trend of this decline of international legitimacy, heightened global risk, geopolitical risk, was exactly right. So well done to those who were part of that first project. Secondly, what came up back in 2016 and has manifested itself in the years since is this crisis of political legitimacy around the world, particularly with democracy. In fact, this year is likely the 20th year of democratic decline. And back in 2016, we talked about how citizens in democratic countries, non-democratic countries, were challenging government in very visible ways through protests, everywhere from Brazil to Spain to Gambia to Thailand. reflect on the last 10 years. We've just seen a recurrent sort of questioning of the political legitimacy of governments. And I don't necessarily see a real improvement. I think, again, with the return of President Trump and the steady decline of democracy in other parts of the world as well, it does feel like this crisis of political legitimacy or democracy has continued. And we have to think looking towards 2030 as we are in the project this year, um, to what extent is democracy on its last legs? Is democracy dead? Is this a post-democracy era? I think again, in the last year or two, we've raised this question in the Wikistrat project with my grad students and with other partners. But I think, again, we were spot on back in 2016, and we've seen that trend continue. You could argue that with social media and now AI, that it's even more likely that we'll see governments lose legitimacy as other spaces become more relevant. So that's definitely something that has come up in our discussions. Number three, the major global risk trend that we talked about 10 years ago was a crisis of economic legitimacy. To what extent is globalization in the post-Cold War era? Is it going to last? And as we know, in the years since, we've seen a steady rise in economic nationalism, populism. Of course, we couldn't have predicted this very prominent global tariff war that President Trump has unleashed on the world. But I think our judgments were very much spot on. I think back then we also talked about the youth unemployment crisis that was feeding into the crisis of political legitimacy with bursts of economically driven unrest. Again, at that stage, we couldn't have predicted that this would escalate in terms of inflation-related protests. And I think what we'll likely see going into the next year and through 2030 is more economically driven protests that relate to artificial intelligence, right? The idea that AI is obviously going to impact many of our jobs. There's already a rise in AI anxiety, particularly in Western countries, according to some of our research at NYU. And I think that's probably going to be a significant risk. And that came up in our risk list last year in Newsweek, as well as the World Economic Forum. So again, I think we're 3 for 3. The big global risk trends we predicted in 2016 have effectively just continued in the decades since. And last but not least, and I think this is the area of global risk that sadly doesn't get sufficient policy attention, this idea of an identity crisis. Are we globalists? Are we nationalists? Do we care about the other? At that stage in 2016, we noted the rise in anti-minority sentiment. We noted that in certain countries, refugees were being targeted. And of course, this was after years of Islamophobia and now resurgence in anti-Semitism trends. At that stage, we couldn't have predicted this would become even more prominent, but there's no question that trend has evolved. We've observed the evolution of hate and extremism, partly because of technology, social media, and now AI tools are being leveraged by many of these groups. But the fact that governments, world leaders, we don't have to name who, but world leaders are being very explicit about targeting minorities and having a more homogenous national identity at the expense of minorities in certain countries. So it's unfortunate this risk has evolved. And as I said, I think already since last year, our collective crowdsourced research has shown that it's unlikely this will stop. And it's more likely that more of these tools from technology will be leveraged to spread the hate. So it's really unfortunate. But again, our 2016 predictions for going into 2017 have sadly been proven to be fairly accurate and have just evolved in the last decade. So something to keep in mind. But I did want to also point out that, of course, this crowdsourced approach that we use has been very beneficial to allow us to get the benefit of not just my grad students and students at other universities. And this year we have students from Singapore and also from a few other schools. But such a benefit to have the perspective of experts from different fields who are part of the Wikistrat community. So it's definitely beneficial. Obviously, there is, you get more angles, and I think that's beneficial. Of course, there are pros and cons to every approach, every methodology. With so much data that we collect, it's possible certain risks get overlooked, certain shock events might not be considered. So that's something to keep in mind. We have in the last, I think, 4 years also focused on shock events, so the less obvious risks. And that led to, in fact, I think it was 2 years ago, we had an article in Time magazine that looked exclusively at shock events. And in fact, I think many of those shocks are still very much in play. Although one of the shocks has already come true, that we predicted that the shock was that President Trump would return to office. So that's of course behind us now. But we had talked about the potential for climate change obviously is evolving. It doesn't look like it's going to be tackled by our world leaders. I mean, COP30 and the COP events prior to that have shown that. But we did anticipate, and we still feel this. We said this 2 years ago, and it came up again last year, that it's very likely that a shock event would involve a private actor trying to tackle climate change through climate tech, for instance, solar geoengineering. So it'll be interesting to see if that comes up in the next sim that we do that's kicked off today. We also talked about the evolution of extremism and terrorism, particularly the shock of eco-terrorism making an ugly comeback. So again, given the struggle to tackle climate change as a global community in the Trump 2.0 era and just generally, I think that's still a very plausible shock. And last but not least, we talked about this growing narrative around the US dollar. Are we going to see it replaced in international trade? We didn't think it was high plausibility, but still we framed it as a shock. And already we've seen many countries in the last few years move towards trade in their own dollar. I think there's more momentum again about a BRICS currency, and of course now central bank digital currencies. So I think a lot of the shocks of the last two projects that we've done together are still very much in play. So anyway, so that's the overview of what we came up with back in 2016. Again, I would argue that we were fairly accurate, and on some level, those four themes, have still proven to sort of shape the dialogue that has happened since then. And of course, the shock events of the last few sims are still relevant to the discussion. So that's what I would say about that. I think definitely if you saw our World Economic Forum piece, this was last summer. In fact, we did talk extensively about the AI risks, and I think that's still going to be very relevant. Perhaps the most overlooked risks relating to AI going into 2026 and frankly through to 2030 are the ones that impact society. I mean, I think there's no question there's a unfortunately growing number of cases where AI tools are leading to mental health, violence, and even suicide. I think that came up in our list in the past, and I think that's probably going to be relevant. It's ongoing, I'm afraid. We also talked about the occupational identity crisis. I think that's as AI does take away jobs, I'm not sure the transition will happen as quickly as CEOs and tech leaders have suggested. We're not yet clear on the return on investment, but I think that's definitely going to be a concern going into 2026 through to 2030. Who are we without our work? And if we don't have a sense of purpose because the job opportunities are drying up due to AI, I would imagine that will heighten social risk, economic risk, and just overall global risk in many countries. So yeah, it's not it's a bleak picture, but I think the good news is we have been fairly accurate. in the last, well, looking back to 2016 through now, we've been fairly accurate. I think it would be amazing to see spin-offs of our work in terms of how do we tackle the risks, more policy focus, strategy focus. Certainly willing, happy to talk about that after this project wraps. How do we come together as a crowd to think of better strategy to tackle these long-term risks, trends, and shock events? So yeah, that's what I wanted to say. But thank you again to everyone who's participated in the last 10 years and who's signed up for this year, and looking forward to seeing you online. That Tali, take it away if you want to, if there are any questions.
Thank you so much. Super interesting. Definitely, I second Yuma saying thank you, everyone who's been joining us year after year and new participants as well. Please feel free to submit your questions using the chat option. For now, I will start with actually a question that we've received on the first onboarding call for the simulation, which is, do you have any tips or methodologies for risk prediction? Someone wants to come up with a new risk. What do they do while staring at this blank paper?
Yeah, I think the first step is to just reflect on what we've done more recently. What are the broad trends that have come up? And of course, our project is broken down according to geopolitics, politics, economy, society. So trying to make a judgment where I think take a step back, where do you feel we will see heightened risk? Which category of risk? I think that's the first step. And like I said, the second step is to just reflect on what we've produced in recent years. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Do you see a significant shift in what we predicted? And I think that would be a good approach. And yeah, of course, my students have their approach. They've been hearing me speak all semester. I see some of them are on the call, which is great. But looking at our past judgments, looking at the four categories, and just decide, maybe digging into one category or one particular risk that you think must be included in our 2026 or 2030 projections. I think that will be really helpful.
When we're looking at very major disruptions that happened in the past decade, even if we're looking at the past 5, 6 years, so obviously COVID, right? Russia, Ukraine, Israel, Iran.
Yeah.
Did we forecast those? And if not, what would be the reason that we miss sometimes very, very major disruptions?
I think that's always the challenge with a crowdsource approach, and then ultimately having to pick, right? We ultimately have to make a judgment, which are the 10 or which are the handful of risks that we highlight. But I will say that I believe Wikistrat was one of the first to predict the Russian invasion of Ukraine, if I'm not mistaken. We were covered in the Financial Times back then. So that's significant. Um, but yeah, I think there are pros and cons to every approach. Eurasia Group has a certain approach with its group of experts, of course, but also having high level access to world leaders. And I'm a fan of Ian Bremmer. I'm also part of the World Economic Forum, as you know, formerly focused on risk and now more foresight as an advisor. And of course, every year they have the Global Risk Report. And it's based on surveys of from experts, from CEOs, academics, etc. So I think we have a similar approach. You can't cover everything, but I think our goal, as especially as the lead team, is to kind of make a judgment. How can we spot the trends from the risk and shock trends from this body of work that has been crowdsourced? And I think there's certainly an element of bias. I think on some level that's unavoidable. I think it would be interesting, and this could be a useful exercise for my students or the other students who are part of the sim this year, to look at our past lists and evaluate, grade it, and even ask AI tools. Let's ask ChatGPT or other AI programs to evaluate how accurate we were, and to ask it to show us what were our major blind spots. Are we avoiding that in this next project? I personally have found AI tools to be Although you have to be worried about hallucinations, there are areas of weakness, but it can be a very useful thought partner and research partner. And I've even this semester had my grad students at NYU get involved with using AI tools to see if they can elevate their work. And I think it has elevated it. So maybe that's something we can think about once we, at the end of the week to kind of collect all of our data and see what does ChatGPT or what do other AI tools think are the key risks based on all of the data, as opposed to just what we, the lead analysts, kind of come up with. I think that could be a useful exercise, actually. Um,
Are
I think,
there
is there a,
any? Yeah,
oh,
there is a question. We'll get to it in a minute. Until it's very long. Until then, reflecting on the past decade and risks that we may have missed or maybe miscalculated. Are there any lessons learned to improve the methodology to remove blind spots?
yeah, no, that's a good question. I think, like I said, I think AI tools could help us maybe have another option, another perspective on where, looking at all the data, where are the blind spots? I think that could be useful. I think our judgment in the last couple of years to introduce shock events, I think, is another way to kind of highlight the less obvious risks that maybe fewer people are thinking about. So I think those are just two key ways that we've already tried to overcome that, or that we could overcome that. But yeah, I think the benefit of our approach is that it's empirically rich, right? If you see on the sim, as you know, Tali, I mean, people put a lot of effort into their entries, and it's really I think that empirical richness, I hope, comes through in the ultimate output that we share with the world, whether it's Newsweek or Time or World Economic Forum. I think that's significant. I see that we have a couple of questions. Should we maybe look at those?
Yeah, definitely. So, one question is how do we turn accurate foresight into actionable policy, especially when the issues like the mental health toll and special forces remain hidden from public view? And the same would apply
That's
to our military
uh,
partners, such as Afghans who came here previously involved in classified work.
got it. Yeah, no, that's a great question from, I think it's from Monica. I agree with you. I think once we produce our risk lists and shock lists and we share it with the world, I think it could be useful as a follow-up to have us maybe brainstorm specific policy and see how we can, tailoring the policy suggestions based on our risk analysis. I think that could be a useful exercise. So I'd definitely be excited if some of the analysts from the sim wanted to follow up with a project like that with us. I think that could be useful. I think there was a comment from Tracy. Could you post a summary table of the identified risks in the various categories from the last 3 annual simulations to serve as a prompt for this year? I think that could be useful as well. I think right now we've just included the past few uh, op-eds that were written about it, but maybe Tali, maybe we can think about sort of showing the top risks in each
Oh,
category for at least the last
yes.
2, 3 years,
Yeah, we can
just so
definitely
people can,
share the top
yeah.
risks. Every year we end up, I think, assessing over 100, maybe over 200 risks. So I think it will be a bit tedious to go over
Yeah,
600 risks just to get started. But yes, that's a great idea. We'll definitely share the top risks per category, hopefully even later today. Thank you.
that'll be great. And um, yeah, I think, I guess this is in the background of the project. It's written on the sim, but I think just reflecting on where we are today. We are in an era shaped by Trump 2.0 policies. Whether you agree or disagree with his approach, that's up to you. But I think just taking into account what are the risks that could be a result of the Trump 2.0 era, I think that could be useful. And obviously, the broader trends that we've talked about in the past are still very relevant. Artificial intelligence, we tend to get a lot of AI. The last year or so, we've definitely gotten a lot of AI related risks and shocks. I think that's still very, I mean, I would be eager to see what other risks and shocks relating to AI might come up in this project. And also, of course, climate change. Although, a lot of governments are holding back in the Trump 2.0 era in terms of climate focus. Um, what does that mean for risks and shocks? Are we going to see a bigger refugee crisis? Are we going to a climate refugee crisis? Are we going to see more natural disasters, etc.? I think the more specific we can be in our entries that people put forth, the better. Keeping in mind again the Trump 2.0 era, the bigger trends, climate, war, and of course AI. I think that would be super useful. So, okay. So
Right.
I
I
I don't
think,
I don't know if there
yeah,
are there any
we've
other
got
questions?
some more questions from registrants. And I
Okay.
think it's going to be the last one, unless someone wants to jump in and write a new question in the chat. But can forecasting models adequately account for the role of rationality, political calculations, and emotion in shaping crisis?
Ooh, I feel like a student must have offered that question. That's a good question. I guess we haven't been, um, we're not trying to necessarily shape everyone's perspective. Are they looking at the world through the lens of rationality or through the lens of some other theory? I think that's up to you. I guess I would still say, so let's simplify it. Let's just recognize where we are today. The world order is shifting, as we know, with the Trump 2.0 era. We know that there is a crisis of democracy. We know that there is a challenge to globalization, and we know that there is a crisis of identity with rise in hate and xenophobia. I think those are the sort of, that's the lens, at least the global risk lens that I use when I sift through all of the work that's produced. So you're welcome to add on to that and think of other, methodologies or, feel free to be creative. But I personally won't impose anything more than what I've already said in terms of the four global risk trends that have really built or evolved since 2016 when we kicked off this project. So don't overthink it, but at the same time, if you would like to add on an additional lens, please do so. And we're eager to see a broader range of entries, not just the same ideas every year. So that's what I would say about that. But I'm so excited to that we're kicking off the 10th collaboration. I'm a big fan of Wikistrat and Tali and Oren, and I know that every year my grad students at NYU are always so excited to lead the effort. So it's a real pleasure, and yeah, let's hope we can better understand the world through our risks and shocks this year. And ideally, that will help everyone else in our audience um, make better decisions. That's really the agenda. Let's just enlighten people.
Right. Thank you
Okay.
so much. And
Okay.
thank you, everyone who joined us today. Thank you for joining this really amazing simulation. And I'm looking forward to reading your insights on the platform.
Me too. Thank you guys. Take care and reach out if you have any questions.
Yes, definitely.